Hello and welcome to this module for educational psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie and this is module 2. Within this module we'll be taking a look at the psychological development and the different cognitive models for learning. So to begin with, we're going to be looking at the theories of psychological development. Theories are explained about how the world works, and in development, theories suggest how or why people change or remain the same over time. Theories help inform research. Theoretical concepts and assertions need to be tested through research. And theories should be modified based on research results. They are not facts. They are subject to change. One of the first theories is a theory that grows out of the early part of the 20th century and is part of the Freudian psychodynamic theories. And it suggests that psychological needs motivate our actions. Now, the first part of the first theory is Freud's psychosexual theory, and then something that grows out of that is Erikson's psychosocial theory. So we'll take a look first at Sigmund Freud. He first offered a comprehensive theory of personality, and he viewed this as something that is part of the early biological drives and motives that form personality traits. Now, he lived in the Victorian era, and in the world that he lived within Austria, he lived in a time in which genetics was a popular explanation for human behavior, and it was believed that instinct was what drove a huge amount of human behavior. And for Freud, he studied an ailment called hysteria that had mystified the clinical world for a long time. And hysteria was originally thought to be a disorder that was something that, from Freud's perspective, he considered it to be part of a genetic explanation. But he also thought that ideas played a huge part in the formation of this disorder. And when he saw that people suffering from hysteria had a wide variety of genetic backgrounds, and that many of them shared traumas of or ideas of traumas in early childhood, he came up with the idea of the talking cure, that somehow deep down within the unconscious of the mind, there was defense mechanisms that became so dysfunctional in the early childhood of the individual that as the child grew up, these rigid defense mechanisms began to cause mental illness. So for him, mental illness was a problem of thinking. It wasn't something where you were bad or immoral or diseased necessarily. It was simply an inability to process some difficult aspect within your early life. And so Freud described a variety of defense mechanisms, and these are ways that people distort how they process painful truths within their life. And this is something that causes a distorted view of reality later on within life. Now, few of us can handle painful experiences psychologically as soon as they happen. It takes time for us to process them. And sometimes when we do not process them in a fully healthy way, mental disorders can come about from this. So one of the ways that the mind uses to alleviate some of the emotional pain and anxiety of a traumatic memory is to repress, to avoid thinking about something that is upsetting. So that's repression. And oftentimes, people say, I'm just not going to think about it. Or a friend says, don't worry about it, just stay busy, that kind of thing. But without processing it, that can cause problems. Another one is regression. And regression involves returning to a time in life when you felt safe. Perhaps this means reverting to your childhood psychologically. When you feel sick, or when you've had a tough day, sometimes you just want to curl up in the corner and eat chocolate, for example. So this defense mechanism is very common, but probably less common than repression. Then there's rationalization, and this is the use of seemingly logical explanations to explain away a painful truth. For example, someone who's abused may think that if they are simply better at what they're doing, that the abuse won't happen again. That's not true, but it's a way of processing through and making a meaning for the person. But it can cause problems. There's denial. Denial is lying to yourself. You simply say, no, that didn't happen, or that's not so. That bad thing won't happen again, when statistically it probably will. The sublimation. Sublimation involves transforming unacceptable urges, such as aggression or sexual urges, into acceptable behaviors, such as exercise or extreme competition. There's displacement. Displacement involves carrying out frustration onto a safer target. For example, you've had a tough day. Your boss is giving you a tough time at work. You're overly upset about what your boss has done, but you can't yell at your boss. So you come across a friend and you let out your anger or frustration on your friend. That's displacement. You weren't really angry at your friend, but you had to release that energy somehow. Or you punch a wall or something. Then there's projection. Projection is the tendency to attribute your feelings onto others. So a person who's angry suggests that it is someone else who is really mad. Then there's a reaction formation. Reaction formation involves outwardly opposing something inwardly desired, or something that you fear. A person who is rigidly opposed to something might really be fighting their own tendencies towards that thing. So all of these are defense mechanisms that really can tie your emotions up into knots. And that's what Freud sees often as the part of the unconscious problems that can lead to rigid, dysfunctional behavior in your conscious life. And so it's important to bring those unconscious defense mechanisms into reality. And under Freud's psychic apparatus, his Freudian theory, he suggests that there's three main parts to a person. There is the id, that's the very unconscious, wild part of you. It's an inborn part of you. It responds to biological urges without pause and is guided by what he called the pleasure principle. So if it feels good, it is a good thing. That's how the id operates. So, for example, a newborn is all id. The newborn cries when hungry. They defecate when the urge strikes, and there isn't anything to regulate that. Now, another part of a person is the ego. The ego develops through interaction with others and is guided by logic or the reality principle. It has the ability to delay gratification. It knows that urges have to be managed. It mediates between the id and what is called the superego, using logic and reality to calm the other parts of the self down. The superego is the rules that you catch from other people, the things that say what is good and what is bad. The superego represents society's demands for its members. It is guided by a sense of guilt or shame. Values and morals and conscience are all part of the superego. Now, Freud argues that there are some specific psychosexual stages that you go through, and it is important to move through these psychosexual stages in a healthy way and be able to resolve and move successfully to the next stage in order to be psychologically flexible enough to meet the demands of the adult world. So for Freud, the personality is thought to develop in response to the child's ability to learn to manage these biological urges. So here parenting is important. If the parent is either overly punitive or overly lax, the child may not progress to the next stage. The oral stage lasts normally from birth until around age 2. This is, remember, where the infant is all id. At this stage, all stimulation and comfort is focused on the mouth and is based on the reflex of sucking. So you see a child under 2, things are going to go in the mouth. Too much indulgence or too much stimulation may lead to fixation on that oral stage. The next stage is the anal stage, and this coincides with potty training or learning to manage these biological urges of being able to use the bowels. The ego is beginning to develop at this stage. Anal fixation may result in a person who is compulsively clean and organized, or one who is compulsively sloppy and lacks self-control. The phallic stage, then, occurs in early childhood and marks the development of the superego and the sense of masculinity or femininity as culture dictates. And according to Freud, then, there is the latency phase that occurs during middle childhood until the child's urges quieten down and friendships become the focus. Here, the ego and superego can be redefined as the child learns how to cooperate and negotiate with others. And then finally comes the genital stage, and that marks the beginning of puberty and continues through adulthood. Now, the preoccupation is that of sex and reproduction. Freud focused on biology as a prime motivator. Erikson suggested that our relationships and society's expectations motivate much of our behavior, and in his theory of psychosocial development, Erikson, though a student of Freud's, emphasized the importance of the ego, or the idea of conscious thought, in determining our actions. In other words, he believed that we did not be completely defined by the drive of unconscious urges. We know that what motivates us, according to Erikson, and we consciously think about how to achieve our goals. He, therefore, is considered a father of developmental psychology because his model gives us a guide to the entire lifespan and suggests certain primary psychological and social concerns throughout life. Now, for Erikson's, in his first 4 stages, he addresses childhood. Each stage is an elaboration of the previous stage. So, for example, a sense of trust in infancy can extend to a sense of autonomy in toddlerhood. Trust versus mistrust is the first values crisis in infancy. The infant is dependent and hopes that needs are met. If so, the infant may gain a sense that the world is a trustworthy place. Then comes autonomy, or what is called self-rule, versus shame and doubt. And this is a struggle of toddlers. Once the toddler can walk and talk, the toddler wonders where to go and what to say. The ability to be independent within safe limits is the goal of this stage. And then comes initiative versus guilt, which guides early childhood. The child wants to plan and begin a task or project without assistance. Maybe it's building a fort out of the couch and cushions, or putting together a play and making paper tickets. Now, the goal here is initiation, not necessarily completion within initiative versus guilt. Then comes industry versus inferiority. And this is the primary concern once a child is learning how to get along with other children and begins participating in school or other endeavors in which children come together and are compared. Industry involves being very busy and trying out one's skills. It's about finding joy in using your skills. Hopefully the child has successes and believes that they measure up well. when comparisons with others are made. Then comes the last four stages, and these last four stages address adolescence and through adulthood. Adolescents struggle with identity. Teenagers struggle with the question, who am I? Who am I socially, physically, sexually, morally, academically, and so on? They're trying to define themselves. It's identity versus role confusion. Then comes the early adult. And the early adult is focused on the values crisis of intimacy versus isolation. So once identity has been established, the person is in a better position to make intimate, long-term commitments. Then, as you emerge into adulthood, then it's about being productive. So generativity or productivity and a sense of giving back to the next generation are a concern during midlife and much of adulthood. A person looks at life and hopes to be doing something that is worthwhile. If not, they may feel stagnated or stuck. And they might be encouraged to make changes within their life. Then there is integrity versus despair. And this concerns us at the end of life. We want to look back and think that we have lived according to our beliefs. We want to see agreement between who we are and what we've done. If not, we may experience a sense of despair because time is now running out and we see the end coming. So those are some psychosocial theories that talk a little bit about development. We're now going to explore a little bit, go beyond the psychodynamic theories and look more at behaviors, because behaviors are observable. We're going to look at three theories: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning theory. Now, with classical conditioning, the explanation for that is how we learn to feel the way that we do. This comes from Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist who discovered that certain cues in our environment can create automatic physiological responses in us. For example, if you think of lemons, you might start to salivate and your mouth might pucker up. The reason is because you've associated the word lemon with an experience of tasting a lemon. Now, the word can bring about the same response as the actual entity. Classical conditioning occurs when we learn through association. The reaction is physiological, it's at a gut level. This physiological response can influence our nervous system, our heart rate, our relaxation, our respiration. And our body changes in expectation of an experience or emotion. And so our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, part of our autonomic nervous system, gets engaged and ready for what is expected to come next. And Pavlov's understanding of classical conditioning developed out of his work when studying how saliva breaks down food. He noticed that a dog has a tube attached to his mouth, and it was designed to capture saliva that can measure when a dog is eating. Now, Pavlov noticed that the dog produced saliva even before he introduced the food. So the dog began to salivate when he heard Pavlov's assistant coming down the hall. Now, Pavlov wondered why, and he realized because the dog knew that footsteps come before food, and therefore The dog's body was getting ready to digest by producing salivation. Salivating to footsteps is a response to a psychological event or thought process. Pavlov called this a psychic reflex and began to prepare another stimuli to feeding. For example, he rang a bell just before feeding. After that pairing was made several times, the dog would then begin to salivate to a bell. So let's review some terms by applying these to the experiment that I just talked about. Before conditioning has occurred, we see that dogs naturally produce saliva when food is introduced. So the unconditioned stimulus is food. The unconditioned response is salivation. After the bell has become associated with food, the dog begins to salivate when hearing the bell. The conditioned or learned stimulus is now the sound of the bell. The conditioned or learned response is to salivate to the sound of the bell. Now, let's go beyond dog salivating and take a look at John B. Watson. Watson built upon Pavlov's work by applying the principles of classical conditioning to children. He was considered a parenting expert in the 1920s and wrote a column in newspapers giving advice to parents. And he rejected the idea that genetics explain all of our actions. Rather, he thought that learning was the key to determining how children behave. Consequently, he emphasized the importance of parenting practices. He believed that children could be taught to love or hate anything associated with unconditioned stimuli. He demonstrated this in his work with a boy by the name of Little Albert by teaching Albert to be afraid of a variety of animals and other objects after they'd been associated with a loud noise, which Albert automatically feared. Now, eventually, Watson left academia, and he carried his message of the learned response to advertising. One of his first clients was Sunkist, a company that sold oranges. Watson created an ad in which a beautiful woman was shown holding an orange. Now think about this example and identify the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response to the review. The unconditioned stimulus is the beautiful woman. The unconditioned response is attraction to it. You condition. Now, eventually, the conditioned stimulus is the orange, and the conditioned response is desire for the orange. Now, let's turn our attention to operant conditioning. This is an explanation of why we repeat voluntary actions, or operants is what they're called. For example, why do we demonstrate a voluntary action right now as you're working on this lesson? What did you do? Perhaps you raised your hand, or you looked up. Maybe you decided to stand up or to say something. All of these are operants. Now, if I wanted to encourage you to do this again, how would I go about it? Maybe asking you to do it again would be sufficient. But chances are, I would need to make it rewarding in order to get you to repeat a certain action. Now, this is where the law of effect states that an organism will repeat an action if it is followed by a good effect. If I were with you now, I might be able to smile when you stood up, and therefore that would increase the likelihood that you would stand up again. Reinforcement encourages a behavior. That's the idea. And that brings us to B.F. Skinner, who brought us the principles of operant conditioning, suggesting that reinforcement is a more effective means of encouraging a behavior than is criticism or punishment. By focusing on strengthening desirable behavior, we have a greater impact than if we emphasize what is undesirable. Reinforcement is anything that an organism desires and is motivated to obtain. A reinforcer is something that encourages or promotes a behavior. Some things are natural rewards. They are considered intrinsic or primary when their value is easily understood. Think of what kinds of things babies or animals such as puppies find rewarding. A smile, a laugh, a encouraging hug. Extrinsic or secondary reinforcers are things that have a value not immediately understood. Their value is indirect. They can be traded in for what is ultimately desired. So that would be like money. The use of positive reinforcement involves adding something to a situation in order to encourage a behavior. For example, if I give a child a cookie for cleaning a room, the addition of the cookie makes cleaning more likely in the future. Think of ways in which you positively reinforce others, or how others positively reinforce you. It happens to all of us. Now there's negative reinforcement, and this occurs when taking something unpleasant away from a situation encourages behavior. For example, I have an alarm clock that makes a very unpleasant noise. It goes, brr, 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 wake up, wake up. This loud sound goes off in the morning. As a result, I get up and I turn it off. By removing the noise, I am reinforcing getting up. There's lots of ways that negative reinforcement is used on us or on others. Then there's punishment. Punishment is an effort to stop a behavior. It means to follow an action with something unpleasant or painful. Punishment is often less effective than reinforcement for several reasons. It doesn't indicate the desired behavior. It may result in suppressing rather than stopping a behavior. In other words, the person may not do what is being punished when you're around. They will still try to get away with that action, only avoid the punishment, but continue the action. And a focus on punishment can result in not noticing when the person does well. It's better to focus upon reinforcement, positive reinforcement, than on punishment. Not all behaviors are learned through association or reinforcement. Many of the things we do are learned by watching others. And so that's where we're going to now talk about social learning theory. Within social learning theory, that is when you copy or imitate or learn a role by watching what other people do. Others might include family members or friends, as well as role models in the media. We use modeling as a quick guide to tell us how to act, particularly when we are in new situations. Perhaps you've started a new job or become a parent. One of the ways that we learn how to behave in these situations is to witness someone else in this role and use them as a rough guide. Albert Bandura had a famous experiment where he used what was called a Bobo doll experiment. And when he would go in and punch the Bobo doll and then leave the room, it didn't take long before children were demonstrating a new aggressive behavior that had come before. Now, so that's social learning theory. Then we have cognitive theories of development that explain how our ability to think changes over time. Our thoughts and reasoning abilities differ when we're 6, or when we're 16, or when we're 36. A child is not simply a small adult. They think completely differently from an adult. They process information differently from an adult. And so we'll focus on two main theorists here. The first one is Jean-Jacques Piaget, who's really considered a father of cognitive psychology. He offered a theory of how our ability to make sense of the world changes as we mature. Our desire to understand the world comes from a need for cognitive equilibrium. This is an agreement or a balance between what we sense in the outside world and what we know in our minds. If we experience something that we cannot understand, we try to restore the balance by either changing our thoughts or by altering the experience to fit into what we do understand. Perhaps we meet someone who is very different from anyone we know. How do we make sense of this person? We might use them to establish a new category of people in our mind. Or we might think about how they are similar to someone else that we have met. So a schema or schemas are categories of knowledge. They are like little mental boxes of concepts. A child has to learn many concepts. They may have a scheme for under and soft and running and sour. All of these are schemas. Our efforts to understand the world around us lead us to develop new schemas and to modify old ones. One way to make sense of new experiences is to focus on how they are similar to what we already know. So the person we meet who is very different may be understood as being sort of like my brother, or his voice sounds like yours, or a new food might be assimilated by us determining how much it tastes like chicken. This assimilation is something that helps us to change, to learn, to grow. Another way to make sense of the world is to change our mind. We can make a cognitive accommodation to this new experience by adding a new schema. This food is unlike anything I've tasted before. I now have a new category of foods that are bittersweet in flavor, for instance. This is not assimilation, this is now accommodation. So we can either do assimilation as we learn, where we connect something with what we already know, or we can do accommodation, where we create a whole new category for thinking about things. So just give some thought to what are some ways that you use assimilation, what are some ways that you use accommodation. And this will help you to really begin to understand cognitive learning. Now, Piaget suggested different intelligences or ways of understanding that are associated with maturation that are really tied with our biological development. The first one is a sensory motor intelligence, and this is based upon knowledge that relies upon our senses and our motor skills. So from birth until age 2, the infant knows by tasting, by smelling, by touching, by hearing, by moving objects around. So this is a real hands-on type of knowledge. Then there is pre-operational intelligence, which involves being able to think about the world using symbols. A symbol is something that stands for something else. The use of language, whether it is in the forms of words or gestures, facilitates knowing and communicating about the world. This is the hallmark of pre-operational intelligence and occurs in early childhood. However, these children are pre-operational, or what we call pre-logical. They still do not understand how the physical world operates. They may, for instance, fear that they will go down the drain if they sit on the front of the bathtub, even though they are too big. Then we come to concrete operational intelligence. And this is the ability to think logically about the physical world. Middle childhood is a time of understanding concepts such as size, distance, and constancy of matter, and cause and effect relationships. A child knows that a scrambled egg is still an egg, and that a short, wide glass of water is still the same amount of water as a tall, thin glass of water, no matter what the shape of the glass is that contains it. They understand that. Then comes formal operational intelligence, and this is the ability to think logically about concrete and abstract events. The teenager who has reached this stage is able to consider possibilities and to contemplate ideas about situations that have never been directly encountered. More abstract understanding also takes place in the religious realm, or the moral realm, or the ethical realm. Abstract principles such as freedom and dignity start to become important. So as a child goes through each of these stages, they discover new ways of processing information. Then we come to Lev Vygotsky. And Lev Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist who focused on the process of guidance and interaction that occurs in all cultures when teaching cognitive skills. He believed that cognitive abilities were not entirely dependent upon physical maturation. Cognitive abilities, he argued, are acquired through guidance and through an interaction with others. So interaction with others becomes extremely important. This interaction involves scaffolding in which the child or the apprentice is learning a given hands-on assistance along with an explanation of what is going on as they learn to perform a task. And the key is to work with a child within their zone of what is called proximal development. That is connecting what they can do already with what they are struggling to do. And in that zone of proximal development, then, what they are struggling to do becomes what they now can do. And so they moved along the continuum. And social engagement and engagement with others as they are going through this process facilitates this movement across the continuum, where what was once something they struggled with now is something that is easy and automatic, and then they can move on to the next thing. The task needs to be stimulating enough to engage the child, but not so difficult that they cannot achieve it. And that's why the zone of proximal development becomes very important. You don't want to discourage the child, you want to make success possible, and so you pull them along that way. And then finally, there's Yuri Bronfenbrenner's model that explains the direct and indirect influences on an individual's development. For Bronfenbrenner, microsystems impact a child directly. These are the people with whom the child interacts directly, such as parents and peers and teachers. The relationship between individuals and those around them need to be considered in the learning of the child. For example, to appreciate what is going on with a student in math, the relationship between the student and the teacher should be appreciated. So that's the microsystems, the direct relationships. Then Bronfenbrenner argues that beyond that are the mesosystems. And these are interactions between those surroundings, those things that surround the individual. The relationship between the parents and the schools, for example, will indirectly affect the child. Larger institutions such as the mass media or the healthcare system are referred to as the exosystem. And these have impact on families and peers and schools who operate under policies and regulations found in these institutions. We find cultural values and beliefs at the level of macro systems. And these larger ideals and expectations inform institutions that will ultimately impact the individual. All of this happens in an historical context referred to as the chrono system. So cultural values change over time, as do policies of educational institutions or governments in certain political climates. Development occurs at a point in time, and we need to understand how all of these different systems influence the individual. So in order to understand a student in math, we can't simply look at that individual and what challenges they face directly with that subject. We have to look at the interactions that occur between the teacher and the child. Perhaps the teacher needs to make modifications in that relationship. The teacher may be responding to regulations made by the school, such as new expectations for students in math or constraints on time that interfere with the teacher's ability to instruct. And these new demands may be a response to national efforts to promote math and science deemed important by political leaders in response to relations with other countries at a particular time in history. So, in essence, this systems model of Yuri Bronfenbrenner challenges us to go beyond the individual if we want to understand human development and promote improvements. Okay. Now, that's a whole lot of information. So maybe we will narrow things down a little bit and just look at middle childhood. And maybe focus on the idea of information processing theory. Now, if we think in terms of the mind as a computer. It will help us to understand the information processing theory that helps us to understand the mind. Information processing theory it's a classical theory of memory that compares the way in which the mind works like a computer that's processing, storing, processing, and retrieving information. And we can really think about this, there being three basic levels of memory. First, there is the sensory register, and this is where information first enters our sensory register. So you need to be exposed to the information. So just take a moment and just look around your room that you're in right now. Now close your eyes and ask yourself, what do you remember about looking around? Chances are not very much. Everything you saw and heard entered into your sensory register, and although you might have heard yourself or caught a glimpse of some books on the shelf or a smell wafting down the hallway, you did not register those sensations. Sensations are continuously coming into your mind, and yet most of these sensations are never really perceived or stored in your mind. They're lost after just a second or two because they are immediately filtered out as irrelevant. If the information is not perceived or stored, then it is quickly discarded. So the first question you have to ask is, did the sensory register process this information? So you need, and in order to facilitate that, it needs to be felt as important by the person. Then comes the working memory, also sometimes called the short-term memory. If information is meaningful, so it reminds us that it is important and it's something to be played with, then it makes its way into our working memory. And this consists of information of which we are immediately aware. All of the things on your mind at this moment are part of your working memory. Now, there's a limited amount of information that can be kept in the working memory at any given time. So, if you are given too much information at a time, you may lose some of it. Now, the general rule is that you can hold 7 pieces of information in your working memory, plus or minus 2. It's going to vary from person to person, but as a general rule, you can hold 7 pieces of information. So just think about a telephone number. The reason a telephone number is 7 digits long is that is the limit of what an average person can hold. Now, some people's working memory can only hold 5. Some people's working memory can hold 9. But as a general rule, 7 is a good guide. Things within your working memory, because your mind just can't tend to handle more information than that. Information in your working memory must be stored in an effective way in order to be accessible to us for later use. It is stored in our long-term memory, or what is called our knowledge base. Now, if you process information and use it within your working memory, your short-term memory, and revisit it day after day after day for 5 days, then it tends to be absorbed into your long-term memory, also known as your knowledge base. Less of it is forgotten. Your knowledge base, or your long-term memory, this is the level of memory that seems to have an unlimited capacity and stores information for days, months, and years. It consists of things that we know of or can remember if asked. We can retrieve this information. This is where you want information to ultimately be stored. The important thing to remember about storage is that it must be done in a meaningful or effective way. In other words, if you simply try to repeat something several times in order to remember it, you may only be able to remember the sound of the word rather than the meaning or the concept of the word. There needs to be deeper processing that goes on, and it needs to be done over time in order for it to really stay within your long-term memory. So, if you're asked to explain the meaning of the word or to apply a concept in some way, it will be lost if you just repeat the word over and over again. Studying involves organizing information in a meaningful way so that you can retrieve it later. Passively reading a text is usually inadequate and should be thought of as only the first step in learning material. Writing keywords, thinking of examples to illustrate their meaning, and considering ways that concepts are related to all techniques helpful for organizing information for effective storage and later retrieval are all important here. Now, during middle childhood, children are able to learn and remember due to an improvement in the ways they attend to and store information. As children enter school and learn more about the world, they develop more categories for concepts and learn more efficient strategies for storing and retrieving information. One significant reason is that they continue to have more experiences on which to tie new information. New experiences are similar to old ones or remind the child of something about which they know. And all of this helps them file away new experiences more easily. They also have a better understanding of how well they are performing on a task and the level of difficulty of a task. As they become more realistic about their abilities, they can adapt studying strategies to meet those needs. While preschoolers may spend as much time on an unimportant aspect of a problem as they do on the main point, school-age children start to learn to prioritize and gauge what is significant and what is not. This skill is known as saliency determination. You look for what is the important things in what you are learning. They develop what is called metacognition, or the ability to understand the best way to figure out a problem. And then they gain more tools and strategies for remembering something. And all of this can help with the learning process. So it's important to be mindful of all of that. Now, we're just going to finish off this module with a little bit about language development and vocabulary and new understanding. So vocabulary, one of the reasons that children can classify objects in so many ways is that they have acquired a vocabulary to do so. So by 5th grade, a child's vocabulary has grown to about 40,000 words. It grows at a rate of 20 words a day, a rate that exceeds even that of preschoolers. And this language explosion, however, differs from that of preschoolers because it is facilitated by being able to associate new words with those already known, and because it is accompanied by a more sophisticated understanding of the meanings of the words. So when we look at the new understanding that a child has, the child is able to think of objects in less literal ways. For example, if asked for the first word that comes to mind when one hears the word pizza, a preschooler is likely to say eat, or some word that describes what is done with a pizza. However, the school-age child is more likely to place pizza in the appropriate category and say food or carbohydrates. This sophistication of vocabulary is also evidenced in the fact that school-age children are able to tell jokes and to have fun in doing so. They may use jokes that involve plays on words, such as knock-knock jokes or jokes that have a punchline. Preschoolers do not understand plays on words and rely on telling jokes that are literal or slapstick, such as, "The man fell in the mud." Ha ha ha, isn't that funny? And then there's grammar and flexibility. School-age children are also able to learn new rules of grammar with more flexibility, while preschoolers are likely to be reluctant to give up saying things like, "I goed there." School-age children will learn this rather quickly, along with other rules of grammar, and so that is helpful to be mindful of. While the preschool years might be a good time to learn a second language, so being able to understand and speak the language, the school years may be the best time to be taught a second language, as far as the rules of grammar are concerned. So all of that needs to be kept in mind as we think about how the mind works, how it processes information, and how it changes over time. Just be mindful of all of these things. The basic essence of this module is simply this: that children do not think the same as adults. It changes over time, and it depends on multiple factors on how a person thinks. So just be mindful that at any given time, an individual has a unique way of processing information, a unique way of viewing the world. You are not the same person that you were when you were 5 years old. You're not the same person that you were when you were 10 years old, nor the same person you were when you were 15 years old. We change over time, and we grow and mature. And part of the joy of being a teacher is to, first off, understand what is going on with a child as far as their information processing capabilities go, and also be a part of that growth and maturity within the child's life. And that ends our lesson for Module 2. You take care. Bye-bye.